Welcome to Final Girls Berlin Film Festival. As you probably know from checking out the program, we are a film fest that's dedicated to horror films made by women and non-binary filmmakers. And we're also very excited to invite specialists to our festival from all different places around the world. So it's really wonderful that we have Alexandra Heller-Nicholas with us tonight for her talk, Ghouls to the Front, Rethinking Women's Horror Filmmaking. I'll just say a quick word about Alexandra. Alexandra Heller-Nicholas is an award-winning film critic, author, and academic. She has written 8 books on cult, horror, and exploitation film, with an emphasis on gender politics, including Rape Revenge Films, A Critical Study, Masks in Horror Cinema, Eyes Without a Face, which was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award, and most recently, 1,000 Women in Horror, from 1895 to 2018. Alexandra is a member of the Alliance of Women Film Journalists, the Australian Film Critics Association, and is on the advisory board for the Miskatonic Institute for Horror Studies. And by the way, we're huge fans of the Miskatonic Institute, so we're very happy to be co-presenting this with that great institution of horror. She holds a PhD in screen studies from the University of Melbourne and is a research fellow at RMIT University and an adjunct professor at Deakin University. And yes, you can follow her on Twitter at Suspirialix, or her website is thebluelenses.com. I'll hand this over to Alexandra, and please stick around afterwards for a Q&A/open discussion. You can enter your comments and questions into Eventive throughout the talk, and we'll come and address them afterwards. Thank you, Alexandra.
Hi, everybody. I have to let you know it's morning. It's Sunday morning in Australia. I'm sure that you guys are all over the planet in its different time zones, and it's all very exciting. This is my cat, Rumpole. I don't know if you can see him there, but we just had a massive fight. That's my technical problem of the morning. As you can see, he won, so he's sleeping it off. He's basically my research assistant, but he could wake up and go bananas at any point. So this could turn into an amusing cat video at any moment. Just a little heads up there. All right, back to business. Yes, let's talk about the book that ate up an enormous chunk of my life, just in terms of time and energy and tears and joy. That's starting to get weird. So basically, in terms of the scale of this book, as the title may suggest, I start right back in 1895. And I want to go everywhere with this book. That was my goal, was not just to be historical, but to be very geographically broad. We've got Bolivia, Belgium, Indonesia, Italy, Australia, the Philippines, Uruguay, Sweden, Russia. I really wanted to look beyond, I think, what we perhaps commonly assume is, that very narrow US, UK, European history of not just women's horror filmmaking, but film in general. No offense to people in the US, the UK, or Europe. So yes, really wanted to be quite broad with this, in the hope of really underscoring that there's just a tremendous range of material when it comes to what the kind of work that women have done in horror cinema, whether it's as actors or directors or editors or composers or screenwriters or negative cutters. You guys get the idea. All right, so some of the things that I want to focus on today, a little touch on questions of canon formation, who gets remembered and who doesn't, and how that relates to the archive in terms of what things and stuff we can actually access and watch and put our hands on and what we can't. The archive is a really slippery little thing, and as you'll see in some of the quality of the clips that I have to show you today, sometimes we're running on scraps. We also had a few hiccups with sound, so please, if I play a clip and there's no sound, just let us know in the chat. I'm sure these guys will let me know, but fingers crossed we'll be okay. So the question of what is remembered and what is left out often results in a dominant version of history that risks totally obliterating entire threads of cultural. So people can't see. I'm going to pause because I think we're sending a link to Zoom.
Yes, sorry to send you this update now. Ellie says she's not seeing it on Zoom right now. On Eventive right now. So
okay.
If people are able to see that, then maybe weigh in on the chat in Inventive. And let us know that all is working. But it seems Ellie right now is checking the other link, so we will find out if that other link is working. Sorry about the interruption.
No, that's fine.
Okay, Ellie says, damn, I see. I guess that's
brilliant.
Good, Dan. All right. You can continue. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. As long as everybody can see this quite remarkable photo, I'm going to talk about this at length. So basically, yeah, this question of the archive about what gets remembered and what gets left out of history, the problem with this is that we risk losing entire threads of cultural production made by people that really don't get a seat at the table. You know, and what we're often talking about here is people who aren't straight white men. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-straight white men, some of whom work with women filmmakers, but from a historical perspective, the overprivileging of this one particular demographic has meant that other people, whether it's women, people of color, queer creatives, or other minority groups, it renders them by default comparatively invisible. And that's one of the big things in my book, is this idea of invisible labor. So this all obviously matters for reasons beyond film history or horror film history, and just applies to history across the board. When we privilege one dominant version or story of history, it means that things that don't fit into that story get ignored or fall off our radar. And we have to work together, all of us, to try to fix that and to try to keep a pretty broad perspective. So the phrase hidden in plain sight comes up a lot when we talk about these kind of ideas. So when I say history, I think it's worth noting that I'm not necessarily talking even as far back as 1895 or 1925 or 1965. This here is a picture of a 1998 Hollywood issue of Vanity Fair that I stumbled on totally by accident. And it's a banger. When it comes to women's horror filmmaking, this photo was taken by Annie Leibovitz, by the way, quite famous photographer. This image is just a weaponized fuck you to anyone who thinks that the deletion of women's horror filmmakers from popular memory is a thing of the past. If we look really carefully at this photo, some of you might already recognize some of the people here. We have people like Nick Cassavetes, Kevin Smith, Greg Araki, but we have 4 women filmmakers. And what I find so extraordinary about this photo is that 3 of them have made horror films. Now, this is Vanity Fair. They're not here because they made horror films. But I do think it's quite amazing that 3 of the 4 women in this photo, identified by Vanity Fair as the newest wave, you know, this sort of upcoming new talent, can be directly linked to horror filmmaking. The most obvious person here is down in the bottom corner. That's, of course, Mary Harron, who made American Psycho. But if we look here on the other side, we have Katja von Garnier, who in 2007 made the werewolf film Blood and Chocolate. And in the middle there, with the jaunty little hat, we have Julie Davis, who did Witchcraft 6, The Devil's Mistress in 1994, aka Witchcraft 666. Witchcraft 3, The Kiss of Death, of course, was also directed by a woman, the great Queen Rachel Feldman, back in 1991. All right, so I guess this is a good way to start thinking through what lies at the heart of what I really want to throw out there in terms of women's horror filmmaking today. Basically, there's a whole history of work in the genre that goes right back to cinema's earliest days that can really help us loosen the shackles of dominant genre history and just find somewhere to breathe and to think about this and to talk about this stuff outside the dominant sausage fest. I guess this is a good way to start thinking through what lies at the heart of what I really want to throw out there in terms of women's horror filmmaking today. Basically, there's a whole history of work in the genre that goes right back to cinema's earliest days.
Can you please turn off your mics and cameras?
Yeah, I'm getting a massive echo of everybody. Sorry, I just heard myself back, and it's that weird thing where you hear yourself speaking.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thanks, team.
Out there. Yeah, mic and camera both, please.
Let me catch up to where I was bitching about the sausage fest of horror as per usual. That's just how I roll. That's it, really. That's the talk, just me bitching about the sausage fest. Let's go right back. Let's go right back to art. And let's think, why am I talking about directors specifically in this talk today? So I don't want to get too heavily into auteur theory, but there's a lot of debate historically about how and why we even came to understand the director as the so-called author of a film, and not say a screenwriter or a producer, or even talk about it more organically as a collaborative process, which of course cinema is. There's a bunch of feminist art history that's really useful for us to think about here. So from the 1970s onwards, the idea of the single male genius, and I put that in inverted commas, this has been the source of a fair amount of critical attention in this field, and that applies to filmmaking too. Women's history of collaborative production, the widespread, although not dominant, exclusion of women from formal training and mentorship, all of these things have given us in the visual arts a history that's really, really full of dudes. You just go to an art gallery if you're in a place in the world where you can actually go to an art gallery at the moment, and it's just full of work by men. So this is not specific to horror. It's not specific to cinema. This male dominance it's part of visual culture. It's part of culture. There are, of course, really important women artists that we can go right back to. This here is pretty much Exhibit A, this artist and images like this. This is one of our tribal elders. This is one of our most important women in horror ancestors. But it's fairly reasonable to say that in the visual arts, the dice have been pretty heavily loaded against women getting access just to tools to make art, and to any formal recognition that might follow from that. And this applies again to other creatives from unrepresented demographics who just haven't had access to that place at the table. It's certainly not just women alone. All right, so the question of feminism is really important when thinking through women's creative practices like painting or filmmaking or writing or tuba playing, or the thousands of other ways that human beings have found artistically to express themselves. To start with, what's often overlooked in tiresome social media debates about this subject often fails to really define its terms. What do we mean by feminism anyway? We don't need to look far to see how people really weaponize this word as sometimes to use, to present some pretty ugly, hateful attitudes and responses. And there's this umbrella term of feminism that some people use to kind of shield or justify their bigotry. I'm sure you don't need to be told this, but this can get really nasty. So it's perhaps very useful for us to start, just as a basic starting point, the words by an art historian called Peggy Phelan, who basically argued that gender difference is a major way from a sociological perspective that power is organized, and that this has a strong historical tendency to privilege men over women. This is basic, that's kind of stating the obvious, but as she points out, pretty much everything else is up for debate under this umbrella term of feminism. So I think it's really useful to keep that in mind. And again, I know that this might sound simplistic, but I do think it's really important that for those of us who do identify as feminists, that we're not reductively weaponizing it as a slogan, but actually demanding and really actively and explicitly working towards the things that really matter, things like respect, visibility, acceptance, and just a basic fucking fundamental respect for human rights. I'm sorry I swear a lot. I'm Australian. This is how we roll. Anyway, to get back to the topic at hand, I don't think it's as simple as saying something as generalized as all women filmmakers are feminist or all women horror filmmakers are feminist, because I don't think that really gets to the heart of what we need to talk about and what we should be talking about. And what's important here, I think, is to remember that there's some really pivotal, some really key women horror filmmakers who have explicitly rejected the label. And I think that we need to maybe take that on board, and they have particular reasons for rejecting that label, and we should perhaps, instead of attacking them for that, maybe we need to listen to why they have felt that way. And this is often the case with filmmakers, women horror filmmakers, who for some of us have clearly quite explicit feminist themes in their work. So this stuff can get really complicated. We just have to keep our minds open, I think. And my goal and what I really hope for is that somewhere in all these gaps and contradictions and tensions and anxieties all around the gender politics of horror cinema, we can find exactly what it is that makes this specific genre so uniquely positioned to critique, subvert, and transgress so many of the dominant gendered norms that define the status quo. So for me,
Sorry, I
Yeah,
didn't cut you off. Somebody on Eventive, or a few people are commenting that your mic is a little bit distorted. Can you maybe
right.
move
I'll
it,
just move it back a bit. How's
and
that?
even a little more, maybe? Can you speak a bit?
Yeah, if people can let us know. I think I'm just
That's
screaming,
better.
swearing, and screaming.
You're doing great, and I think that's an improvement, so thanks so much.
Beautiful, beautiful. Um, so this issue, I mean, I've been talking here about feminism, so I think it's probably fair for me to say, you know, what do I mean when it comes to my own politics? Like, what do I mean when I talk about myself and feminism? I think that seeing you guys are listening to me screaming and swearing at you, you have the right to have clarity on that. So this is basically me. This I would like to think that this is a visual representation of me and how I respond to people who say things like trans women aren't women, or people who disrespect sex work and sex workers. Um, I have very strong feelings about people who deny the importance of things like race and class and disability, and how they intersect with feminism. I don't think feminism is a simple boys versus girls equation. But most of all, this image, I think, represents me when it comes to those good old-fashioned nerd jock dude bros who just think that horror and chicks don't mix. I'm sure that we've all met them. I'd like to think that they're a dying breed, but there's still far too many of them around for my liking, although I suspect that they might not be watching a lecture like this. All right. And then there's the question of violence. So an obvious reference point here historically is Mary Shelley, queen of body horror, who provided a quite legendary springboard for thinking about women and horror authorship with her 1818 novel Frankenstein. As we'll see in some of the clips that we go through today, there's lots of different ways that women represent violence, and there's lots of different ways that women engage with horror. I don't know if there's something called, if we can look at a film and say, oh, this film was definitely made by a woman. Sometimes we might be able to, but I think we make a real mistake. And it's actually quite insulting to assume that women are that narrow in their talents and their skills and their visions. And I guess I want to mention here a quote from Jane Campion that I think is really great. She said at the Cannes Film Festival in 2014, time and time and time again, we don't get our share of representation. For Campion, ignoring a filmmaker's work because of their gender results in cinema becoming an echo chamber, adding, it's not that I resent male filmmaking, but that there's something that women are doing that we don't get to know enough about. And this, I think, is really different from the conventional wisdom that sometimes suggests that women's storytelling or women's filmmaking automatically means that women are somehow gifted in telling stories about women characters. I think some of my favorite women-directed horror films are actually about men and masculinity and male characters. So we need to keep a pretty open mind about that sort of aspect as well, I think, and not have expectations about the kinds of films that women filmmakers make. And hopefully when I get to my case studies today, that will get you guys thinking a little more broadly about that. But let's start right at the beginning. I know that when I was a kid, I can't pinpoint the exact moment that I even realized that women could make films. I think that when we're little, films are just there. We don't think of them as made objects. Films just exist. I think the first time for me that I became aware that of the director of a film or the idea of authorship was when my mum introduced me to Alfred Hitchcock when I was about 10 years old. She was a huge fan, and I think that was like the first director that really pinged my radar. And I find that really interesting because I think there's some of us but maybe of a certain generation that we might have actually seen films when we were kids that we didn't even realize were directed by women, films such as these. If you were a cool kid, I was not a cool kid, these might have been those films that, you saw as a kid and you just didn't know. Maybe you did know. But yeah, obviously here we have Rachel Talalay's Freddy's Dead, Mary Lambert's Pet Sematary, and a film I mentioned earlier, Mary Harron's American Psycho. But whatever the moment was that we started thinking about women as directors, I do think it's really worth privileging, even if we can't consciously remember it, that this actually stands in opposition to the norm, that invisible reality, the conventional wisdom that it's unusual for women to make film. There's the assumption that men make most of the movies. It's men who are given the money and the opportunities, and it's men who so many times get second chances when they fuck up. They get second chances, they get third chances, they get fourth chances. This is all really relevant. All right, so let's do this and get into some of the examples here. What follows is effectively me taking you on a bit of a kind of chronological tour just through some of the stuff that I discovered that was new to me when I worked through the book, or some of the stuff that I found since. This lecture was first done in Austin in 2018 at Fantastic Fest, and just after that I published this article on Vulture, which you can find. So I've actually quite a lot on this list was in my original talk, so I've kind of mixed it up a bit. I've taken some things out, put some new things in. But yes, plug, if you get my book, there's a filmography a selected filmography at the back of the book of over 700 films. I really want to emphasize that some of the films I'm playing today, like, I haven't chosen them because I'm not trying to present a singular history of women's filmmaking. What I want to do is get you to sort of think more openly about, my God, there's so much stuff out there that we just have missed or that we just don't know about. Some of you guys will be right on top of a lot of this. Some of you, there'll be more new stuff, but I'm hoping that everybody will maybe find at least one thing in there that is relatively new to them, or at least start thinking, like I said, just start thinking more broadly about this idea of what have we missed, because that's, I think, really what lies at the heart of my talk as a whole. I guess, yeah, the bottom line is that horror is not a boys' club, and it never has been. And we can start right back with early cinema with Alice Guy. She's often called Alice Guy Blaché, but her ex-husband was an absolute pig, and she called herself Alice Guy Blaché, but I refuse to. He was horrible, man. She's really important, right? Like, she's like, not just for horror filmmaking, but for cinema in general. And I think that we need to give her a lot more credit for from horror circles about her influence. She's famous for making the first narrative fiction film, The Fairy of the Cabbages, in 1896. And she's considered one of the first filmmakers to employ special effects. With her ex, the scumbag Herbert, don't get me started, she established Solax Studios. She was one of the first women to run a film studio. A lot of her work hasn't survived, but I think if we look at it retrospectively through the lens of horror, gothic, and the dark fantastic, she actually worked a lot in this terrain. She did Esmeralda in 1905, The Bloodstain in 1912, The Face at the Window in 1912, The Little Hunchback in 1913, The Monster and the Girl in 1914, The Lure in 1914, and this here, of course, is her adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum. Lois Weber is another really groundbreaking filmmaker. She was a writer and actor. She did all sorts of things. Really one of the most important women in the history of American filmmaking. She's certainly not obscure. One of her most notable achievements was that she filmed the first full frontal nude for a film in her 1915 directed film Hypocrites. She made amazing films. She was making films about reproductive rights. She was probably the first woman in the United States to run her own studios. And she used split screen. She would make Brian De Palma blush. I mean, this woman was a maniac with the split screen. She's often talked about as the first woman who, the first filmmaker who used split screen. And that's technically not true. I think there were some people in the Netherlands who were doing it. But yeah, you've got to see this. This is wild. Now, a lot of the clips I'll play, or the movies that I mentioned, these are on YouTube, and the team at Final Girls will be providing links to these. So I'm only going to play some short clips, but I do want to play you guys a little clip from this. This was the one that I could find with the best visual quality, but it does have subtitles. So I'll just play a little bit. So as I've said elsewhere, and other people have made the same observation, that's basically a proto-home invasion film. It's a really important film, I think, in horror film history. This is Louise Fleck. She's broadly considered the second big woman feature film director after Alice Guy. She was born in Vienna, and she established Austria's first major studio company, film production company, Österreich Kinofilmsindustrie, with her brother and her husband. She worked really prolifically. She moved to Berlin in the 20s and eventually went to China in 1940 after her husband was released from Dachau concentration camp. Of her many impressive credits, in 1911, she and her brother were co-directors on the 1919 ghost story, The Ancestress. And this one here, the 1920 film Anita, about a woman dominated by an evil hypnotist. I'm obsessed with this image. If you look at the guy down in the center of the front holding the woman's hand, who I'm assuming is the evil hypnotist. I haven't seen this film. I've seen The Ancestress, but I haven't been able to source this one. I just love that if you go to a horror film festival, there's like just 100 guys that look like him, like beardos. And I just, in my dreams, I know it's not true, but I just so want to believe that it's Louise Fleck cosplay, that these guys are dressing up as characters from Louise Fleck films. Speaking of cosplay, we should all be dressing like Germaine Delac. We should be building cathedrals for Germaine Delac. We should have public holidays and parades in the street for Germaine Delac. Hugely, hugely, hugely important woman. Feminist filmmaker, often credited with making one of the first surrealist films. Thank you. There's another sausage fest. No, we have Germaine Delac, a poo-poo on the sausage fest is surrealism. Her film, The Seashell and the Clergyman, again, it's on YouTube in full. You have to see this if you haven't, and I hope a lot of you have. It's really, it just delves into this beautiful, deep, dark, gothic imagery. It's all about death and murder and sexual repression, all the good stuff that we love. This was written by Antoine Artaud, who's another really key figure in the French avant-garde. And he's often synonymous with the concept of the theatre of cruelty. That's sort of his brand. These two people, there's a whole story about this film and the way that they didn't get along. You don't need to hear that today, but they were pretty metal, right? This film is totally worth watching. I mean, I would argue that somebody like David Lynch wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the influence of Germaine Delac. I mean, you watch this film and you can feel it in there. I think that she's way more influential than she's given credit for. Let's watch a tiny little bit of this. How great is that? Put on some Diamond de Galas, play it loud, watch that, you're set. All right, Alois Gist, amazing woman, amazing woman. We are in the United States, back where we were just talking about Lois Weber. And really, another really important pioneering filmmaker. She's a Black filmmaker. She was born in Texas in 1892, grew up in Washington, D.C. Her husband, James, was an evangelist, and together they felt that cinema held enormous potential in spreading their message of religious faith and redemption, especially to you people. You horror people are often sinners, I find, so I thought I'd just throw this in to try to redeem you all. Together they made in the early 1930s this absolutely remarkable film called Hellbound Train. It's understood that she wrote most of the screenplay and she directed many scenes in it. So the film's basically this dancing dude in a devil costume picking up a range of sinners on the eponymous train, each of who are depicted in a variety of standalone little scenarios or vignettes. Different kinds of sins, different affronts to God. These films were really popular. They would travel around with them. Alois would play the piano while they played the films. They would play them in Black churches. This is on Kino Lorber's Pioneers of African American Cinema collection, which if you haven't got your hands on is pretty essential. I'm going to play you guys a little bit of this. So you guys get the idea. I love Satan in that film with his cute little tail. I don't think that's quite the message that Alois Gist, who a devout Christian, would have liked me to have taken away from that, but he's just got such a cute little tail. Anyway, this is Wendy Toy. She's another one of my favorites, and despite her extraordinary success, you know, she's recently been acknowledged in things like Mark Cousins' Women Make Film documentary, but I don't think she's really had her place acknowledged in horror film history as much as she should have. So she was born in London in 1917. She would become a really noted theatrical and opera director. She was a dancer. She just did lots and lots of stuff. Of course, it's her relation to film that is of interest to us here. She made a short film called The Stranger Left No Card in 1952 that played at Cannes. People like Jean Cocteau absolutely lost their mind over this film. So impressed. But she was, yeah, as a dancer, she had this incredible career. She'd played London's Royal Albert Hall before she was 5. She was choreographing a ballet for the London Palladium before she was 10. What were you doing? I was wasting my time. I was making mud pies. I wasn't doing this stuff. This is somebody that we should know more about. So I've mentioned she made 7 films as a director, and one of the thing that I think really links her to horror film history is one of the segments that she made for the 1955 anthology called 3 Cases of Murder. It's actually 3 directors who are credited for the film, but 4th if you include an uncredited Orson Welles, who sort of on one of the other segments of the anthology is considered sort of Orson Wellesing his way into and co-directing. So her segment was called The Picture, and it's an absolute classic of the haunted painting trope. It's such a great little film. It's just a masterclass of tone and mood. Basically, it follows a guy who works at an art gallery, and he meets the artist of his favorite painting who lives in the house in the painting that hangs on the wall in the art gallery. This guy comes in and out of the painting and talks to the guy, and things get spooky. I did have a clip of this to play, but the sound was all messy, so I'm going to give that a miss. But you guys should be able to find that clip on YouTube. All right, Joan Falls, some animation. She was working with her British-Hungarian husband, Peter, and she wrote, produced, and co-directed one of the most controversial animated films of the 1950s called A Short Vision. So the story is that this was shown on the Ed Sullivan Show in May 1956, and people basically shat the blanket en masse watching this thing. This is basically a short British anti-nuclear horror film that the idea was that it was to show people how terrible, the atomic bomb was and what the fallout would be. It's pretty, I mean, think about a nice suburban family sitting in the 50s, sitting down with their TV dinners on the sofa, and this is what they see. Too good. Too good. I've lost the page. Hang on. All right. This, of course, is, as the label indicates, Brianne Murphy. We're jumping ahead to 1972 here. We have another queen. She was the first woman DOP on a major Hollywood studio film, Fatso. in 1980. She's just a really interesting woman. She literally started off working in the circus, like not metaphorically. She started her career working in the circus. She won an Oscar for scientific and engineering achievement in 1982. Slab of Emmy nominations. She's won Crystal and Lucy Awards for her groundbreaking work in film and television. But relevant to our interests is this treasure, the 1972 film Blood Sabbath. This is wackadoodle. She directed this. It basically follows like a Vietnam vet who's got some pretty heavy PTSD issues going on. He also has an acoustic guitar, evil combination. He returns home, falls in love with a water nymph, as you do, and he's basically so besotted with this water nymph that he decides to make not a deal with the devil, but a deal with Olotta, Queen of the Witches, played by Diane Thorne. This movie is like full of like psychedelic, topless, freak out, go-go dancing scenes, really classic exploitation stuff here. It's well worth your time to watch this one. All right, we're going to the Philippines and we find Lupita Aquino Kashiwahara. I'm so sorry for mispronouncing her name. She was frequently credited as Lupita Econcio. Now, in 1976, she made this film, which is on my top 10 list of horror films directed by women that I have to find. So I'm really putting the call out, I guess. If anybody's got this or knows where to source it, I would love to see it. So I'm reading here from the movie database, which writes of the plot. Anna Carabello returns from the United States after 4 years to fetch her older sister, Sarah, from the Baguio Mansion. Anna spends the night in Manila in a hotel and accidentally meets her former fiance. That night, Anna has a weird dream where Sarah brings her to their dining room and the entire deceased family greet her good evening to everyone. The next day, she is gradually terrified as most of the things that happen in her dream happen in reality. Now, this film starred one of the real idols, like a really big figure in Filipino cinema, this woman here called Nora Anua. And she made her first film in the 1920s, I think. She was also a super famous musician. She has over 50 albums alone, I think 300 singles, something crazy. Look up her Wikipedia, it'll blow your mind. But for those of you, I mentioned her specifically because for those of you who are fans of Natalie Erica James's Relic, Anur actually starred in a 2014 Filipino film called Dementia. It's a very different film to Relic, but it does also focus on the crossover of age, gender, dementia, and the supernatural. It's a really interesting film. So Lupita Concio was really prolific. Good Evening to Everyone wasn't her only horror film. She also made a horror comedy film called Dear Diary, which again, I haven't been able to chase down, but I would love to see that. All right. This is Gabrielle Beaumont. We're back in the UK. Nothing about her career broadly, I think, would suggest that she would be responsible for one of the bleakest evil child films of the 1980s. She did a lot of TV, so she did stuff like MASH, Miami Vice, Hill Street Blues, Doogie Howser, Star Trek. Early in her career, she did a lot of, she worked as a producer on some horror films. But yeah, one of her few feature film directorial efforts is this film here, The Godsend. And it's very bright and sunny. It's got a kind of very daytime vibe to it. But this is a really unflinchingly brutal movie. If you've got to think about kids dying in films, this film isn't visually graphic, but it's quite emotionally intense. Let's have a little look at the trailer from this.
They were the perfect family.
Dad, I've got 3 bucks.
Full of love and happiness.
Oh, Dad. Not to me, Donnie.
Then they were chosen. Is this your first you're expecting?
Oh, no. I have others. Come on, hard. It's wonderful. Oh, she's a godsend.
Baby! Bonnie! A gift from heaven or a curse from hell?
Such a terrible thing couldn't be possible.
Yes, it is possible.
But how?
Don't ask me, but it is.
our daughter.
She is not. Knows whose daughter she is, but she isn't ours. For God's sake, take it back. Don't get Lucy.
I'm going to stop the trailer there. It's one of those old trailers. It actually spells out the entire film and shows you the final scene. So I'll leave it there. The for God's sake, put it back take it back is a good place to leave on. Pearl Chang, let's go to Taiwan. There is a Facebook page for this woman who call her, quote, the Queen of Weird Fu, and I'm very happy to stay with that label. She was also known as Changling or Chungling, and she was a big martial arts action star in the 70s and 80s in Taiwan. So in 1982, she directed this film, Wolf Devil Woman, a kind of fantasy horror film that is just off the chain from its opening moments. Basically, I'm going to play you guys very quickly the opening scene for this film, but the couple that we see in this holding the baby, they escape, they get killed, the baby's raised by wolves and comes back for revenge, the usual stuff. Or is it? Let's check out Wolf Devil Woman. All right, you get the idea. My gift to you is that film is in its whole. You can watch it in full on YouTube. Vera Chidolova, who won't be an unfamiliar name for those of you into Czech New Wave cinema, she just made some of the most original and dazzling and exciting films of the 20th century. Daisies is a classic. It's not horror, but it would be criminally neglectful for me to not mention Daisies. Just one of the most punk rock feminist films ever made. Absolutely incredible film if you've not seen it. But Chidolova worked across many different genres. She wasn't a genre filmmaker, but she would experiment with genres. And this is one of her lesser known films. This is often called Wolf's Hole or Wolf's Cabin. It goes by a couple of names, and it's ostensibly a teen slasher film with a kind of sci-fi twist. But like most of her films, or a lot of her films, it can be very much read through the lens as a not so subtle allegory for the country's then quite contemporary political history and pressures to submit to oppressive, authoritative regimes are pretty clear in this movie. Let's check out a little clip.
Richie, 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 Daddy, Richie, hello, Richie, Richie.
so great. This is a little aside. She also made this film here, Traps, which I believe Second Run put out on DVD. It's really worth chasing down if you're interested in rape revenge films. So I've just wrapped up a very big project on women-directed rape revenge films. My first book was on rape revenge film. And this is a really key example of women-directed rape revenge film. So yeah, Chidilova is very famous as a key figure of the Czech New Wave, but I think that coming from a genre perspective, she's a really, really interesting filmmaker from that kind of angle specifically as well. Alrighty. We're in Mexico. Now, I 100% have to give full credit here to the wonderful Abraham Castillo Flores. He is the guardian of the Morbido crypt, master of Mexican genre cinema, and all-around super-duper nice person who's honestly one of the most generous researchers and archivists I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. He's done a few talks for Miskatonic now on Mexican horror that I really hope you've had the pleasure of seeing. They're quite wild, and he's very rock and roll. Do follow him on Twitter if you're not already, and support the entire Morbid Film Festival team because they do amazing work. This film here is a really good example of a point that is really important to make, in that no one person, you know, I talk about this hidden history or this buried history, no one person can do all that work. It has to be really collaborative. And this is just a really strong case in point, in that I'd never heard of this film until Abraham very generously brought it to my attention. Azalea Vega and her films Lovers of the Lord of the Night is about a woman who goes to a sorceress to help her get back home from the US, where her mother has sent her. She wants to come home to be with her lover. But more importantly, I think it's worth emphasizing just how amazing this film looks. It's just an incredible looking film. Vega's a really prolific actor. She's massive in Mexico. I think for English language speakers, for those of us more familiar perhaps with American cinema, we might most immediately know her for playing Alita in Sam Peckinpah's Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia in 1974. This was her only directorial effort, and it's certainly not an easy film to find, especially in English. So somebody perhaps from a home entertainment company is watching and they get in contact with Abraham and the Morbido team, and it would be really great for a film like this to be out there. And as a quick aside, I know I'm screwing up my chronology a little bit here, but I do want to flag the work of Aurora Martinez. She's based in Chicago, and she makes Spanish language films, which are distributed and primarily made in Mexico. Again, she's super prolific. She made insanely violent films, mostly action movies, but she did a couple of horror films. This Treasure, Bloody Terror from 1990. And Death Dreams from 1995. Shout out to Aurora Martinez. Now, to where I come from, let's talk about Australian filmmaker Anne Turner. She made 5 feature films, beginning her career with this Australian Gothic classic, Celia. This film had a bit of a tricky time when it was released, because it was initially not considered by anybody really involved with it as a horror film, but it got promoted as a horror film. People didn't really know where to put it, and it's only really over time that Celia has really developed a very strong cult reputation, which it thoroughly earns. One of the great privileges of my career was in 2017, I co-curated with Michelle Carey at the Melbourne International Film Festival. We did a series called Pioneering Women on Australian women's filmmaking of the 80s and 90s, and the National Film and Sound Archive in Australia did a restoration of this film that was absolutely breathtaking. I'm going to play a little scene from it now.
Through the long grass, creep, creep, creeping came the hobbyars. Skip, skip, skipping on the ends of their toes ran the hobbyars. And the hobbyars cried, pull down the hemp stalks, eat up the little old man, carry off the little old woman. Then little dog Turpy ran out barking loudly. The hobbyars were afraid and ran home as fast as they could go. But the little old man awoke and cried, little dog Turpy barks so loud that I cannot slumber nor sleep. In the morning I will take off his tail. So the little old man took off little dog Turpy's tail to stop him from barking. That night, along came the hobbyars. out from the deep woods. Running came the hobbyars. Through the long grass, creeping came the hobbyars. Skipping on the ends of their toes came the hobbyars. The little old man awoke and cried, "Little dog Turpy barks so loud that I cannot slumber nor sleep. In the morning I will take off his head." So the little old man took off Turpy's head to stop him from barking. Then little dog Turpy could not bark any more. The third night, along came the hobbyars. They took the little old woman away in their bag. They would hang the bag on a big hook and poke it with their long fingers. The little old man realized he had been very wrong. So he took Turpy's tail and his legs and his head and he gave them back to him again. Then Turpy went sniffing and snuffing along to find the little old woman.
All right, staying in Australia because I risk losing my citizenship if I don't. This is Tracy Moffat, probably one of the most internationally celebrated visual artists who have come from my country, primarily for her work as a photographer, as a video artist, even though most white Australians wouldn't know who she is because Australia is not exactly top shelf when it comes to racial politics, and that is putting it lightly. So Moffat she also very early on in her career did some amazing films. She did a lot of really incredible short films. She did a great film called Nice Coloured Girls in 1987, probably most famously Night Cries, a Rural Tragedy in 1989. Really incredible skills, not just as a visual artist and a photographer, but as a filmmaker and as a storyteller. She's an incredible artist. So her only feature film is this, Bedevil in 1993, which she also appears in. That's her getting her hair done. I love that photo. Bedevil played Khan. To my knowledge, it's the first feature-length horror film anthology directed by a single woman director. I could be wrong on that, but certainly one of the most well-known. The film basically reimagines three ghost stories that she heard when she was a child from both her Indigenous and her European family. And the film again reiterates just her incredible visual style, as well as just being really good ghost storytelling. It really articulates this really interesting, the influence of her heritage.
Listen to three spine-tingling tales.
The children in the area have always told tales about him. Ghosts of the GI, calling them in.
And it was down there, and it was licking my feet, gripping my legs.
Free fall into an uncharted journey.
Shh, shh, shh. I hear it, but I can't see it.
When we lived out here, strange things would happen.
She's here! A little blind girl. She was killed on the track.
Get tangled in a web of dreams.
Why is Imelda always sad?
Imelda had a son. He was her only child. She was never the same after he died.
Bedevil, a new cinematic dimension. Selected for the 1993 Cannes Film Festival. The best films break new ground.
Beautiful. Now, Kei Fujiwara, I know, won't be a new name to many of you, but she's a really truly unique creature, and I think she's definitely worth giving a shout out to. Her background is in theatre, where I believe that she worked for most of her career. She directed 2 feature films. Most of us will know her from her appearance as the girlfriend in the legendary Tetsuo the Iron Man, which I'm sure you've all seen. She would act, write, direct in 2 horror films. She made Organ and Id. It came out in 2005. These are kind of experimental gore films, I guess would be the best way to describe them. It is probably the one that's a little harder to find, so I want to play you guys a little bit of that just to give you a vibe for Kei Fujiwara's work if you've yet to have the luxury of discovering her. Excellent puking, top shelf puking. Let's go to Russia. Let's talk about Svetlana Baskova, who is a maniac. If her 1999 film The Green Elephant is anything to go by, somehow this film is in full on YouTube if you've yet to see it. And if movies about two prisoners in a cell shot in extremely raw footage, very, very close up, rape, poop eating, if body horror, when you find out what the green elephant refers to, you would not, if I told you, you wouldn't believe me. This is a special film. This is a special woman. But this is much, much more than extreme violence for violence sake. This film is often talked about, and my Russian is not fantastic, so my apologies, but this film is often talked about as part of the Chernuka subgenre of films, along with movies like Cargo 200 and The Stoker. And the idea is that they use crime and violence in quite intense ways as a kind of reflection on, or a critique of issues they have a pretty negative vision of Russian culture and society. And this film is very much part of that tradition. She's a really well-established filmmaker. She's made a bunch of other films. Not all of them are particularly easy to come across with English subtitles, but her less sort of aggressive films, I guess, her more famous films, she made a film called Mozart in 2006, and I think the film that she's probably the best known for more broadly is For Marx in 2012. I'm not going to show you a clip from The Green Elephant. You can discover that on your own time. Anne Hui, I really, really, really wanted to finish off with this one. I love this photo because she looks like she's pissy at me because I didn't text her that I was going to be home late. I love this woman. She is a really key figure in the Hong Kong New Wave. And she's very much, she's, a writer, director, producer, queen, goddess, all of those things. And she... she has she's very famous for she did her Vietnam trilogy, which is about the refugee experience. So they're the kinds of films that she's more broadly known for and acclaimed for. But she's got a thing for horror. She made two films that kind of enter our terrain. One of them is called The Spooky Bunch, which is a kind of supernatural comedy from 1980, which is on YouTube in full, which you have to see because I think from memory it's got there's a spirit or a ghost in that with the name of Cat Shit. The only film I think that I've ever seen that happen in, so that's a first. And I'm going to play you guys for my favorite Anne Hui film, 2001's Visible Secret. All right, I'm going to stop it at 2001 because I think at the turn of the century, especially the last decade, I think we've gotten, a little bit more visibility. It just feels neat, I guess, just to do up until that particular date. I guess the whole point of me, doing this is to just get us to start thinking a little bit more broadly. And with all the work that I do with this book, and articles like the piece at Vulture and talks like this, in a way it's self-defeating, because what I really want to encourage you guys to do is to think about what's missing, what's not here. And these examples, I'm hoping, will help encourage you to start working, all of us together, to sort of dig out these treasures. Like, what have we missed? What's still missing? What hasn't been? What have I missed? What have other people missed? Where do we find these films? How do we pad this history out? How do we where do we, these are visible secrets. Let's make these secrets visible. To quote the great Anne Hui, who's angry with me for not calling her because I was home late. Please ask questions. Join us at Gather afterwards. We have a code, 30% off my book. Please follow me on Patreon if you have the cash, because I need to eat. But yeah, most of all, keep talking, keep looking, bring stuff to the table. There's so many films that we've missed. There's so many films that I've missed, and I'm hoping that this just gives you guys a bit of an idea of just how broad this history is and how massive the scale is of the work that we can only do together.
Wow. Thank you so much, Alexandra.
I got there. I went over time. I'm so sorry. And I screwed my mic and.
Well, you're the last of the day, so there's no time limit.
Excellent.
I'm excited by everything you've told us, and I just feel like I have so much to discover, and I'm overwhelmed in the best way possible. And yeah, I wish you could hear us clapping right now. I'm sure you. There's only about 18 of us here on Zoom, but there's about 90 or 95 more over on Eventive, just so you know. So you can imagine a nice room of about 105 people.
That's nice.
And standing up for you right now. And also, I was laughing so much during your talk. So.
Is it my swears? I swear, my son charges me $5 every time I swear. So I can't swear at home. So when I do anything professional, it's not professional, because it's like my free space to drop swears without being financially penalized for it.
Anyway, just want to inform you that I'm sure that the vibe in the room would be super enthusiastic and excited about what you've just told us all. So we're going to be getting some questions in from the audience any moment now. But I just wanted to first ask, what was the process of compiling these films like? How do you find them? Can you recommend any archives? But also, yeah, just what is your investigation process like for getting your eyes on these rare films?
It's really tough. That was probably the biggest challenge, and it still is. There's serious, as I sort of mentioned earlier on, we have serious problems with the archive. I mention this often when I talk about the book, but I've spoken to women filmmakers who literally don't have copies of their own films. They had a videotape and they lost it in a box in a house move. So there are just films that have, and this doesn't just apply to women filmmakers. I think this applies to a lot of, independent filmmakers. We've just lost so much. And of course, nobody cares historically about women's horror filmmaking. No archives, especially when they're government funded archives. We have wonderful people like the AGFA in the US, these sort of more independent archives that do great work with genre archiving, but your national cinema archives aren't rushing out to do these shot on video punk women directed horror films. They're just not being archived, so it's really hard. I'm surprised how much turns up on YouTube. Would be, I guess, the short version. A lot of the stuff that I've mentioned actually is on YouTube in full, because nobody's bothered pulling it down, which in itself, it's great that we get to watch it, but it's also kind of sad in a way that this stuff they're all like strays, they're they're sort of orphan films. And I would love to see so many of these films get, the treatment that they deserve, and to work on the archive in that way.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me that there is actually a new archive in the University of Pittsburgh. Have you been in touch with them at all?
No.
I see somebody there in the Zoom call, Sonia Lufer, who is
Oh, yes.
involved in that. So I don't know, maybe if she wants to add her voice to the conversation about continuing that process,
Oh, that's awesome.
feel free to, yeah, contribute to the talk. So yeah, the questions are coming in. I'm going to do my best to try to address as many of them as I can. Are you more interested in encouraging the ongoing work or in filling in gaps from the historical record? So this is continuing that.
It's a great question because I think they're the same thing, which I know sounds a little bit hazy, but I think it's really dangerous. And I think we saw this a lot around 2014 when we had 2014, 2015, that period where we had things like Babadook and Raw, Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, all of these sort of women-directed horror films that they were quite high profile. And we can see it, in listicles at the time, people were like, oh, did you know that women make horror films? And it's one of my bugbears is that, you see these top 10 listicles and it's the same film, it's Near Dark and it's Pet Sematary and it's the same films over and over and over and over and over again. And I love those films and I'm not dismissing those films, but for me to know where we are now, we need to know our history. And one of the things that I find just in terms of discourse surrounding contemporary women's horror filmmaking are things like I mentioned earlier, like, the assumption, certainly not everybody makes it, but there is sometimes an assumption that women filmmakers are particularly gifted at making films about women characters. And I think that that's a real insult to this very, very long history of women horror filmmakers who have made incredible films about men and masculinity. Jermaine Dulac and The Seashell and the Clergyman is a really great example of that. Just a film about a really violent, horrible man. And there's a great tradition of women directed horror films about male characters. So I think we need to, we can only know where we are now when we know where we came from. So I think that the history and the present are quite, and the future, it's all quite intrinsically linked together. So the more that we get a handle on the past, the more concretely we can be aware of where we are now and where we're going.
Yeah, that's a particular discussion I would love to continue with you later about also the kind of representation that we choose to have at this festival. And yeah, this is an ongoing discussion in our team as well in terms of, do we show films with male protagonists, for example? Is that what this festival is about? Is that what feminist horror needs to be about? What's the difference between feminist horror and women-made horror?
I've just written a book chapter about this that's coming out soon for a book called Bloody Women, which is precisely about exactly these topics. I mean, Karan Kusama's The Invitation it's an incredible film, and I think there's so much going on in that film about, and this is why I tend to defer to the term gender politics, because it allows room to look at the relationship between not just men and women, but masculine and feminine and the grey areas in between. So gender politics, I think, is a bit more of an elastic concept, so that we're not just talking about women. We can actually talk about gender as a broader concept and what happens when there's a woman directing a film from that perspective.
Absolutely. We have a question from Bryony Kidd, who I'm assuming...
Hey! Bryony's a rock star. Bryony's an actual bona fide rock star. Bryony should have been in this talk. She's amazing.
Well, I hope that we can have something from her in the future. We've also shown a film of hers, but as you probably know otherwise, she directs the Stranger with My Face Film Festival.
Where, in fact, I gave a very, very, very rough preliminary version of this talk many, many years ago, maybe 2014. Bryony's a national treasure.
So I'll go to her question. She says, I may have missed some stuff at the beginning about this, but I'm wondering how the book has been received and if you notice any difference and improvement in terms of the conversation around women horror filmmakers in the mainstream.
It's a really good question. I could give the polite, Bryony, like one day over at Wine, I'll give you the impolite answer, but I've written 8 books. My 8th book is coming out. Well, it's out now, or it's coming out in the next month on Giallo Film, and this by far is the book that has just outsold and got more publicity and more attention than all of the others combined by a long shot. by huge distance. And I would love to say that's because I'm amazing, but the bottom line is it's just, this is something people are really interested in now. This is, it was the right book at the right time, and it's not the only book. This fits into, there's wonderful books like Alison Pierce's collection, Women Make Horror, Bloody Women that I mentioned. There's so many books. I'm sure, there's obviously, I can't mention all of them, but there's so much work being done on this, and I think that does reflect a broader interest in this subject. So for me personally, talking about the book and doing interviews and things like that, promoting the book, it's given me a real opportunity to talk about what I talk about in the introduction of the book, which is the invisibility of women's labor. And for me personally, like it possibly is arrogant of me to make a call on the broader discursive field, but for me at least, just having people be interested in that, because it's not, when you say, a lot of people, you say women in horror and they think, the beautiful hammer goddesses in their gauzy little night dresses and things like that. But when you start talking about invisible labor, it's suddenly a little bit less sexy. But suddenly people, for me at least, people are wanting to have those conversations. And this is, for me, a really useful little way to get into having those conversations, not just about the invisibility of women's labor in horror, but more broadly.
Oh, thank you. I'd love to talk to you more about it sometime. So definitely I'll take you up on that wine chat offer.
Done and done.
Glad it's going well. That's excellent to hear though. Thanks.
Got another question from somebody on Inventive. This person wants to know, do you know any female Canadian horror filmmakers?
Yeah, there's a lot. I in my original talk, and I think she might be on the Vulture article. I hope I included her, but I have a suspicion that I might not. We have Gigi Sogyo, I think is based in Canada. She's a Mexican filmmaker, but I think that she has a connection to Canada. The Soskers obviously are from Canada, but Holly Dale is a really interesting filmmaker. She would be, she was somebody that was in the original version of this talk. She made a film called Blood and Donuts, which is a vampire film, which is absolutely gorgeous, and also has a little role in it from David Cronenberg, who plays a kind of gangster, like a mob boss. And Holly Dale doesn't come up a lot in broader discussions about women in horror. She started off as a documentary filmmaker. She does a lot of TV now. But Blood and Donuts is a gorgeous film. So yeah, there's definitely a strong contingency of Canadian women horror filmmakers. But Holly is somebody whose work I specifically had flagged in the earlier version of this talk.
Good to know. There's also a film festival called, I believe, the Bloody Mary Film Festival, which is specifically based in Canada and shows films made by female Canadian horror filmmakers. So
it's an amazingly rich scene there, I think. Really exciting.
Absolutely. Somebody else would like to know, why do you think it has taken so long for female horror films to be taken seriously? I don't know if this person means female directed, but I'm assuming so.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a sad question, I think, in that it's not, like I said, it's not just women horror film directors, it's women directors, it's women writers, it's women, like take women seriously, so we've got this big broader cultural issue with invisibility of women's labor. Your mum does your laundry and you don't say thank you. Women don't get paid as much as men. There's these big things that sort of are where women in horror, these questions are a part of that, those things that fall under that umbrella. I think in horror, like when we had, like I said, there was that period, obviously there were films coming out well before then, but I think that really big burst with things like Babadook and A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night and Raw, that era, I don't know whether it was just critical mass that those things got really quite widespread. They weren't one-offs. I think that there was enough of those films that had a very kind of mainstream impact at one particular moment that it was sort of hard to avoid. But it's like I said, it's very wrong to think that that's a starting point. I mean, that's I think a really interesting moment in terms of the visibility of this stuff. But I also think that it just whet people's appetite. It's like, what do you mean women make horror? You know, what do you mean there's more than the 10 films that get talked about over and over and over and over again? And one of the things I think that horror audiences really crave is just something new. Like, show me something I haven't seen before. And a lot of the films that I've talked about here today do that. Not all, and I really stand by the fact. Like, I hope that we, you know, so many women filmmakers that I've spoken to have said this. And for those of you watching who make films, like, women should be able to make shitty films. And they have, and they do, and that's fine, and we should be okay with that. You know, not everything has to be a masterpiece. And I really champion the trashier films just as much as the ones that play the big international festivals. But all of them, you know, it's all about this question of visibility, you know, the invisibility of women's labor, and their work.
Another question from the audience. Are there themes and depictions that women directors working in horror are probably more able to get away with? And this person says they're thinking of Mary Harron taking on American Psycho, for example.
It's a really good question, because when it started, what I get asked a lot is, you know, do women make certain kinds of horror films? And it's like, well, no, because they're people. They make different kinds of horror films because they're people. And women can make really offensive horror films. They can make really sexist horror films. You know, like, being a woman director it's not a free pass. But I do think that there's something really interesting in that question, in that it doesn't go in that direction. And I really like that, you know, that the idea of being able to get away with more stuff. And of course, you know, like the Roger Corman produced, you know, stuff like Summer Party Massacre, stuff like that. You know, the idea, I think, behind getting those women to produce that sort of group of films, you know, the idea was, well, you know, if it's a woman directing it, then they can't be accused of sexism. Which is pretty cynical, but I kind of think also quite funny and perhaps quite true. So, I mean, when it comes to films about motherhood, you know, I think people, you know, that's a really obvious one, but I think people do react quite differently. I mean, The Babadook, I wonder how that film would have gone if it was directed by a man. And I don't mean that to imply a kind of biological essentialism to it. But yeah, I do think we might have had a different conversation about that film. Certainly, I mean, rape revenge isn't specifically horror. There are rape revenge westerns, huge history of rape revenge westerns. But I think we do tend to have different conversations about rape revenge films when they're directed by women than if they're directed by men. And yeah, I do think the same thing applies to horror. That I like this term of getting away with stuff. So I try. It's always a gift, I think, if you can watch a film not knowing who the director is, and does your opinion of the film change if you find out that the director is a man or a woman? That's always a really interesting little test to play on yourself.
Yeah, I would love to hear you speak more about rape revenge films and how this genre has evolved, what you see as the future of this genre, and how it can be, how representation can change. We had a revenge program last night also, for example. So was that last night? Yes, it was. I can't remember the time.
I got lots to say about rape revenge. Too much.
Another Q&A had mentioned that she's interested in like restorative justice horror as opposed to revenge, for example. So we've been having discussions about it all weekend, and I would love to hear more about your take.
Yeah, I like the phrase justice fantasies. Somebody that I was talking to described, you know, that these films are often justice fantasies. Which is bleak but really interesting.
Just wondering if you had more thoughts on what you see as kind of like the future of that particular subgenre. Or I know that you've mentioned a lot about a variety of representation and any kind of, you know, women can make anything essentially relating to this. But is there something that maybe you have seen missing from the screen that you sort of would be interested in seeing explored?
In terms of rape revenge?
Yeah.
Again, look, this is going to be difficult to answer in one really brief little thing, but again, I guess it feeds into what I've been talking about with the, you know, women directed horror film, which is we have to know our history of this stuff. So one of the really interesting things for me that came out of my first book on rape revenge film, I also wrote a book on Miss 45, so I've written 2 books on rape revenge film, is I talk to a lot of people, and a lot of those people are often survivors, and it's not just fans of these films or audiences of these films, but filmmakers themselves, who are survivors, and that's been the most rewarding thing. I mean, a lot of people that I meet at film festivals, they just want, they're survivors, and they almost want permission. Is it okay that I find these films cathartic? And I'm not the person to give that permission, but I do think that that's part of the conversation that really needs to be had. But I also talk to filmmakers who are interested in making rape revenge films, and they don't want to be that. They don't want to be those kind of people that make, they don't want to be monsters, and they want to kind of try to get it right. And the number of times that people have come to me and they're like, I've got this amazing idea for a rape revenge film. And it's like, it's been done. It was done in 1950s. And, we have to know our history. If we want to move forward, we need to know what's come before. So a really good example of this is, and I've had this happen on more than one occasion, is people have said, what if you have a rape revenge film, but the person who is avenged ends up at the end not being the perpetrator, that it's actually the wrong person. It's like, dude, it was done in the Bravados in the 50s, the Western with Gregory Peck. We've been there. It's done. I'm sorry if I just spoiled a Western from the 50s with Gregory Peck for you, but you've had 70 years to catch up on that film. I don't apologize. But yeah, it's like, if you want to do something, we kind of need to know where we're coming from to get a handle on the diversity. And that's my whole thing with rape revenge, is that these films are not easy to put into one little bubble, because they're so diverse. And this feeds right back to art history. We go back to the Renaissance in Europe, and we had very contradictory, very diverse representations of rape. And we have exactly the same thing happening now in rape revenge. I think it's impossible to say rape revenge films do X. It's like, yeah, but that means that you haven't seen this film, because that film doesn't do that. We need to, it's an enormous field that's very hard to give a very quick answer to. So I guess that would emphasize the importance of that history and an acknowledgement of the diversity, both not just in plot, but also in the kind of ideologies and themes running through them.
Yes, absolutely. Another question from the audience. Have you seen changes to spikes in women in horror film that align with changes in funding, support, new festivals, and distribution?
That's a really good question. That's the stuff that we want to get. They're the conversations we want to have. I'm not sure. I can't quite see here who asked that, but moi to everybody, but especially to that question. It's one of the things that led me to do this project. Was I mentioned earlier, Pioneering Women, the program on Australian women's cinema from the 80s and 90s. Now, that wasn't specifically horror. So I edited a book on Elaine May, who works mostly in comedy. So I was doing work on women's filmmaking, and I was also doing work on horror, and those two threads really came together in this project. But my work on Australian women's cinema during the 80s and 90s really ties into that stuff, because it exploded here. It was an absolute amazing period for women's filmmaking, precisely because there was funding. There were government initiated programs to get women to make films, and as soon as those programs ended, we saw a drop, and the status quo returned. So these conversations are really important to have, because they also affect things like distribution, exhibition, who gets to see them. It's not just about making them, but who gets to see them. So I know I've been talking a lot about the archive, which is really like the end zone, or the end point for a lot of this stuff. But I think right now, because there is so much chat about this subject, I think I would like to think that it would be easier for women to at least have a conversation about funding. But the reality is, just talking to some, and again, you can't make a blanket observation here, but I suspect, I know that for some people, the current buzz, it's a little bit more about talking the talk than walking the walk, that when it comes down to it, a lot of these inequalities still exist. And there are reports and things that show that that's perhaps the case for women's filmmaking across the board.
Yes, I'm going to throw in a question about your other work related to masks in horror cinema. I know you gave a talk about that for the Miskatonic Institute, which I was so sad to have missed because of time differences, the time zone differences. Yeah, I would honestly just love to hear more about that. And also, was there any female directed work in that discussion?
Yeah, so Celia's in that book. That was a really important film for that book. So that book actually was my PhD. So it's not the most sort of punk rock writing I've ever done, but it's a passion project. That project has been sitting with me for probably about 15 years, just, collecting films. And it was just one of those things I couldn't believe that nobody really talked about, talk about hidden in plain sight. What, people will talk about, the masks in Friday the 13th or the masks in Halloween, but there really hadn't been a proper, critical survey on what masks in horror are about. Like, what is this? It's such a dominant iconographic feature. Like, why hasn't there been a broader discussion about the role of masks in horror film? Like, what is it about masks that are so central to horror? And it's just an absolute pet passion of mine. And again, there are other people doing great work in that field, but up to the point that I'd done the PhD, there really wasn't any major book that was really addressing the stuff that I was interested in.
Well, folks, just another reminder to send in your questions. Happy to take more of them. And I was wondering also about, when you finished the book, was there any films that you stumbled upon that surprised you, and people that you, who you wished you had mentioned or who you discovered later?
In the Women in Horror book?
Right. Yes. In the 1000.
Constantly. And I kind of acknowledged that in the book, and it was probably one of the hardest things. It's like, the book started off as like 50 women in horror, and then became 100 women in horror, and then became 500 women in horror. And I had to call it quits at 1,000. So the problem with this project was that it was always going to fail, which I know sounds really miserable, but I wasn't going to get everybody. And the biggest compliment for the book, and I say this in the introduction, and I even leave space in the book to write the names that I've left out, is that it's impossible to capture everybody in 1,000. There's obviously more than 1,000 women who have worked in horror. It's impossible to have every single woman who's ever worked in horror. And I don't even bring film critics or people like that into the equation either. So it's, that was really hard. There's absolutely been people that have turned up. I have a list going. And I use my Patreon a lot for that. This is a person who should have been in the book and wasn't. So the Patreon's almost like a bit of a paying penance. But I can't cover everybody. And again, it's like I can't, I make no pretense. This is not my field. This is part, there's amazing people. The Cutthroat Women Project, there's books that I mentioned, all these amazing, there's so many people. And festivals like yours, stuff that Bryony does, the Final Girls in the UK, it's everybody together doing it all the time. And it's not just women. I mentioned Abraham earlier, the god of Mexican cinema history. Like, we need all these brains together if we're going to get there. And that was part of the humility of doing this book. It's like, I can't do it all, but I just want to show everybody what's left to be done. Like, there's so much more to do. So the biggest compliment for the book would people saying, oh my God, I can't believe there's only 1,000 women. I can't believe you left this person out. I can't believe you only had 1,000. And that sucks, but it's great.
The conversation continues. The work continues. I'm sure in a few years you'll have edition 2 of the next 1,000 women as it continues to grow. So I'll close this out here, but the conversation can absolutely continue on Gather. That link has been shared with all ticket holders, and also it should be in the Eventive chat. I will try to add it here as well before I close the conversation. There is also, as Alexandra mentioned, a discount code for her book, which also has been shared in the Eventive chat and was shared here earlier. And I'm going to copy and paste it again so that you all have it who've joined later. And so let's continue the talk there. And I hope that you'll also all join us For the talks tomorrow, we have a talk by Kate Robertson about young women in horror, a talk by Susie Kalish about cults. The Spinsters of Horror are going to do a live podcast about satanic feminism in horror. And then we'll close the evening with Annie Rose Malamut talking about lesbian vampires. So lots of exciting things tomorrow. And yeah, I'll do a silly plug for our Final Girls Berlin t-shirts as well, which we have from all the different festival editions on our website, finalgirlsberlin.com. So you can check out what we've done in the past over there as well and discover more awesome women working in horror filmmaking. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks so much to Alexandra Heller-Nicholas for being here at our festival.
My pleasure.